I'm Frederick. They told me this in a whisper. Now, you'll hear it. Enjoy watching." The cold wind in the early morning lashed at his face like gunshots, but Jerome stood straight, motionless, like a bronze statue, as if cast from pain, loss, and stubbornness. He did not tremble, did not blink. He looked straight ahead, where on the horizon the empty street of his hometown loomed grey. A place where he had not returned for 7 years. 7 years of hell, blood, explosions, screams, sand under his fingernails and strangers' faces dying in his arms. Now it was all behind him, but it was still inside him. Jerome was in uniform. It was perfectly ironed. The shiny buttons shone even through the dawn haze. On his chest were 3 medals, for courage, for service, for lives saved. Medals that meant nothing to those who did not know what it was like to lose a comrade with a bullet in the neck when you hold him, begging him not to close your eyes. He came home, but there was no one waiting for him. No greeters, no flags, not even sympathetic glances. Only indifference, like a concrete wall, and a slight hostility shining through in every look. He walked down the street like a stranger in his own life. One woman immediately crossed to the other side of the road. 2 teenagers whispered something to each other and laughed, watching him go. Someone closed the window. One man said, "What? Didn't your uniform burn in the war?" Jerome didn't turn around. He walked on, as if in formation. Each step echoed in the emptiness that had grown inside him since he lost Tyler in Afghanistan. A sniper, 1 shot, blood on his face, and silence. He didn't scream when he dragged Tyler's body to the helicopter. He never screamed anymore. Not in the war, not here. Only inside. He didn't come to the city for recognition. He wanted something simple. Silence, a corner, places to forget. But even that seemed out of reach. The building that had once housed his father's barbershop was now boarded up. The sign hung crookedly, like a noose. The neighborhood bakery had become a bookmaker's. Everything had changed, or had simply become what it had always been. He stopped at a bus stop. The shop was peeling, the glass cracked. In the reflection, he saw himself, a black man in uniform, his back straight, his eyes dead. He didn't recognize that face. Not even in the army, not even on the front lines had he felt so lifeless. Here, on this land where he was born, he belonged nowhere anymore. Suddenly, there were footsteps behind him. Fast, angry. Jerome turned too slowly. A hooded teenager threw a can at his feet and shouted, "Go back to your desert, hero!" Laughter. Jerome didn't move. He just watched. The teenager paused for a second, then turned and disappeared around the corner. Jerome picked up the can and put it in the trash. He didn't want any trouble. He wanted to wait for the bus. Just get to a cheap motel. Rest. Try to sleep. But sleep was a luxury. He remembered how, in the tent, amid the gunfire, he'd close his eyes and hear not the gunfire, but his mother's voice, her song. Her voice was as far away now as the world he was defending. Jerome sat down on the bench. The board creaked. He clenched his hands. His knuckles were white. He thought about the time a couple of his friends came home in coffins. How one of them had been sent not a flag, but a bill for shipping the body. Jerome was alive. But was he wanted here alive? A patrol car drove down the street, slowly, as if looking for something. The driver was a white cop in his 40s, with a square face and hard eyes. He looked at Jerome intently. The car didn't stop, but it slowed. Jerome looked back, not defiantly, directly. The policeman turned the corner. So this is how it starts, Jerome thought. He didn't want conflict, but he knew what was coming. No one looked at the uniform here, at the medals. Here, they only saw the color of his skin. Veteran or not, he would always be a threat to them. Even if he saved a white soldier under fire, even if he pulled children from shelled villages, even if he killed those his country called enemies. Here, he was different, and in this different, they saw everything they feared. Jerome stood up as the bus pulled up. The driver didn't even look his way. He walked in, paid, and sat at the back. One passenger moved farther away from him. Jerome looked out the window. It was as if he were looking at the world through bulletproof glass, everything close and everything inaccessible. He didn't know that tomorrow his life would change, that the same policeman would meet him again, that this city, seemingly dead and indifferent, would still have a moment when the masks would fall off. But now he was just driving, and every meter of this road reminded him that he was going into battle, only now, without weapons, and the front was the entire city. The city began with silence, that strange, viscous, wary silence that seemed to suggest, "You are superfluous here." He met no smiles, only glances, quick, fragmentary, but piercing. In this town, where the streets were still paved with the same old brick that remembered the protests of the 60s, everything seemed to have frozen, as if progress had passed him by, and all the hatred accumulated over the decades lay under the asphalt, ready to seep through the cracks. Jerome got off the bus and stepped onto the ground with the same feeling he knew from the front lines, as if a shot would ring out at any moment. Here the shots were different. Contemptuous glances, whispers, closed doors and backs turned away a second before he approached. Too black, too proud, too in shape. He walked past the shop windows where the mannequins were light-skinned and the sellers' glances were wary. In one of the shops, a woman saw him and quickly pressed a button under the counter. He wasn't even surprised. He just looked into her eyes. She looked away, but managed to whisper, "We're watching you." Who? The one who saved other people's children under fire. The one who buried friends so that other people could sleep peacefully. He walked past. He didn't say anything. It wasn't worth it. He knew that words meant nothing here if you didn't fit the norm. It was determined by them. Those in jackets, with flags on their cars, and hatred in their voices, carefully disguised as politeness. The city lived by its own rules. Respect was not earned here. It was given based on connections and skin color. A veteran. They would smile, but then ask, "Are you sure you fought for us?" In the cafe where he went to buy coffee, the barista handed him a glass with difficulty, without touching his fingers. The other customers seemed to suddenly go quiet as he entered, and then whisper again as he left. Someone even followed him out and whispered with a smirk, "Maybe you should go back to where you came from." Jerome looked at him, not with anger, with weariness. He had seen people like that in Iraq. True, they had held machine guns there. Here, plastic smiles. But the point was the same. They didn't want him. They needed him to disappear. He kept walking, straight, calm, as if he were walking through the sirens and fire and fear that had long since taken root inside him. He could feel the eyes on him. In the window of a diner, two men were reflected, standing against the wall, one with a beer, the other with a cigarette. Both were looking at him, talking. One pointed to the medals, the other made a gesture as if he were tearing them off. More laughter. Jerome kept walking. He entered a grocery store. The shelves are gathering dust. The cashier, a man in his 50s, wearing a baseball cap with a Confederate flag, looks at him like he's a thief. As Jerome walked up and down the aisles, a security guard followed him like a shadow. Not hiding, staring, watching, like a predator. Jerome took a bottle of water and a loaf of bread. He went up to the register. The cashier counted the bills as if checking them for authenticity. Then he looked at his face for a long time. "Are you from around here?" he asked. Jerome was silent. He took the change. As he was leaving, he heard, "They're all coming back, to live on our taxes." Jerome stopped. He didn't turn around. He just exhaled. The war seemed to have never ended. It just changed shape. Here, bullets are words. Bullets are looks. This town didn't need a hero, especially not one like this. On the corner, 3 teenagers were throwing bottles into trash cans. One of them, noticing Jerome, suddenly shouted, "Look, there he is, our little soldier. Where's your dog, huh? Where's your white wife?" Laughter. Shouts. One imitated a machine gun. Jerome walked past, not quickening his pace. One of them spat at his feet. He didn't stop. He was used to this, used to the fact that the house he fought for no longer recognized him. On the notice board at City Hall hung a sign, "Thank you for your service to our heroes." Underneath were photographs of 3 white soldiers, young, smiling, not a single one like him. Local heroes, the right colour. His face was not there, and would not be there. He stopped at the house where his grandmother used to live. Now it was a law firm. A young white woman opened the door, looked at him like he was homeless, and closed it back. Abandoned memories. He sat down on the steps of the old library. A man in a business suit walked by. He noticed him, pulled out his phone, took a photo, and immediately started typing something. A few minutes later, a police car pulled up. The same one. He recognized her. And the face behind the wheel. Square, hard, with a predator's squint. Officer Blake got out slowly, as if he knew this moment was his. He approached Jerome. He looked down at him. "Waiting for someone, soldier?" Mockingly, Jerome did not answer. Blake leaned over. "Or are you waiting until you can feel important again?" He grinned. "You know, this is not Iraq. This is where the rules are. And we don't like it when black guys sit where they shouldn't." Jerome stood up, as if automatically. Blake immediately put his hand on his holster. "Quiet, no heroics. I know how this ends anyway. You're leaving, or I'm taking you away." The cars passing by slowed. Someone took out a phone, but no one got out. No one intervened. Jerome looked into Blake's eyes. No fear, no challenge, only emptiness. Blake stepped closer. "Take off that uniform. It's not for you. Understand that already." And then he touched the medal with his finger and ran his hand over it, as if wiping away dust. Jerome didn't move, but something inside him had broken. His land, his street, his people had rejected him. He was not welcome here. He was despised here. He was superfluous. He no longer belonged to war or peace, only in between, and this in between was tightening like a noose. He walked away. Blake didn't detain him. He knew the day was just beginning. They would meet again in the evening, and not on the street, but in another place, where everything would be different. But now the city, having forgotten gratitude, was spitting in his back, and doing it politely, with a smile. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from. Have you ever had similar situations in your life? Moments of injustice, humiliation, when you felt like a stranger in your native place? It is important for us to know what you think. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. And now, let's continue. Blake woke, as always, a minute before the alarm went off. His body had long since become accustomed to the regimen, the military training, stern, almost automatic. He sat on the edge of his bed, slowly putting on his uniform, as if he were putting on more than just clothes, but armor, something more, a symbol of power. For Blake, a uniform was not a tool of service, but a shield of superiority. He did not wear it for the people, he wore it against them. The mirror reflected a face, rough, with sharp cheekbones and a tired look. He was not old, but his face already bore the marks of too many years on duty, too many nights of looking at the streets as if they were battlefields. He poured himself strong coffee, sat at the table where a faded flag hung on the wall. No picture of his family, no drawings by his children, just the flag, the badge, and a sign that read, "Order first." Blake was one of those people who lived by a code, but the code wasn't written in the charter. He lived by his own rules, the old ways, as he called them. His father was a cop. His grandfather was a cop. His great-grandfather was a lyncher. In this family, honor of the uniform had always been inseparable from hatred, carefully hidden under the words safety and order. He left the house, got into the patrol car, turned on the radio. Control reported, "The area is clear. No new incidents. Only complaint about a black male in uniform, behaving suspiciously near the library." He didn't say anything. He just grinned. He knew who it was. He had noticed him yesterday. That face, that bearing, that look, too direct, too proud. And the uniform. He hated it when black men wore uniforms. It was, in his opinion, sacrilege. They don't serve the country, they use the uniform as a cover, he liked to say over beers at a bar with his former comrades. And now one of them had shown up again, back in a city where he was not wanted. Blake drove slowly, like a hunter looking for prey. He knew the streets, he knew the habits, he knew where people like Jerome lingered. He was not patrolling a neighborhood, he was patrolling his territory. Every intersection was his, every movement was under control. He saw Jerome again, standing outside the drugstore as if nothing had happened. And that was what irritated him most. Something about the silence, the calm, the quiet dignity seemed a personal challenge. Blake pulled the car up and stopped at the curb. He didn't get out, he just watched. Jerome didn't look at him, as if he knew he was being watched, but had no intention of playing along. Blake's grip on the wheel was tight, his face calm, but the tension in his eyes was growing. Memories of operations in the inner cities, where every movement was suspect, where every black person was a potential troublemaker. And now this man, this Jerome, with his medals on his chest, his proud posture, was more than just an irritant. He was a threat to the very idea that they could be something bigger than himself. The radio came to life. Suspect at the church, still in uniform. Civilians are concerned. He didn't answer. He just started the engine and headed there. As he drove, he remembered his first meeting with a guy like this. A young guy, 18, with eyes full of fire. Then it was over quickly. A broken nose. The charges were dropped. The witnesses were Blake's friends. He knew how the system worked. It protected people like him. People who kept order, even if it meant suppressing someone a little. At the church, he saw Jerome again. This time, he was talking to an elderly pastor. They hugged. Blake got out of the car. He approached slowly. The pastor noticed him first. He took a step back, as if he knew what was coming. Blake spoke with cool politeness. "Is everything all right, sir? Is this man bothering you?" Jerome turned. Their eyes met. Blake smiled at the corners of his lips, but there was steel in his eyes. Jerome remained silent. The pastor said, "He's a veteran. He served. He's a hero." Blake nodded. "We respect our heroes, only if they act like it." Jerome didn't answer. He just looked. Blake took a step closer. "It's not customary in this neighborhood to show up in uniform without prior notice. You scared the people. They thought there was an operation. There are elderly people, children." Jerome nodded. "I understand." He turned to leave, but Blake wouldn't let him. "You know, I could escort you out of the area, just in case." Jerome stopped. "No need." Blake took a step closer. "This is not a request. This is a recommendation." Jerome turned. He looked into Blake's face, a long, drawn-out silence. And in it was all the fear of the city, all the anger, all the hostility, as if concentrated in these two figures. Blake held his gaze. "You know where you belong." He said it quietly, so that the pastor would not hear, and Jerome left. Slowly, without words. But Blake could already feel how this man in uniform was burning his nerves. He returned to the car, gripping the steering wheel until it creaked. He wanted to do more. He wanted to prove that people like that could not come here and think that they were someone. He returned to patrol, but everything inside was boiling. He knew that there had to be a reason, and he knew that he would wait for it. People like Jerome cannot be let go. They destroy order. They prevent you from living by the rules. His rules. He drove on slowly, looking for the reflection of that same shadow in uniform in the windows. He waited for the moment, and he knew it would come, because men like Jerome never gave in. And that was everything Blake feared. Blake didn't scream. He didn't curse. He wasn't a hurricane. He was a suffocation. Slow, inexorable, sure. And this city that respected him knew that when Blake targeted someone, sooner or later they would disappear from view. Maybe in the precinct, maybe in the report, maybe in the morgue. He waited, and this day was just beginning. Jerome walked down the street, trying not to pay attention to the noise around him. People were hurrying, conversations merged into the general background, cars rushed past. It was an ordinary day, seemingly no different from any other, but for him, every step was difficult. With each movement, he felt how his presence became more noticeable, how the looks as he passed became more and more wary. He tried not to notice them, but the gaze of the policeman Blake, standing nearby, did not leave him. All that Jerome wanted at that moment was silence, to walk just like that, so as not to be noticed, so as not to be touched by these mean looks that were like needles ready to pierce. He was passing by a store when suddenly one of the teenagers, not noticing him, suddenly pushed him in the back. Jerome almost did not feel it. His body was accustomed to blows and pain, but he instantly reacted, balancing so as not to fall. The teenager, not waiting for a reaction, turned around and laughed. "What are you, old man? Like a crane. Tell me what's in your way, huh?" he barked with a smirk, taking a step back. Jerome froze, but said nothing. He knew that such an action was not worth wasting his energy on. But at that moment, Blake approached him. The officer stood like a statue, with an expression that was familiar to Jerome. He was ready to make a move that would cement his power. Without noticing how quickly he had crept up, Blake walked up and grabbed Jerome by the shoulder, forcibly turning him to face him. Blake looked at the teenager, who was still looking at Jerome with a sneer. In that moment, he felt his absolute power, as if the street itself obeyed him. He looked Jerome over, as if he were nothing more than a problem that needed to be solved. There was something menacing in his eyes, something familiar. "I guess it's time to deal with you," Blake said, turning to face Jerome. His voice was cold as ice. The crowd, gathering around him, froze. Jerome was silent, waiting to hear what would happen next, but he felt his heart beat faster. Tension was building in his chest. "Look at you, veteran, in such a disgraceful form," Blake said, glancing at Jerome's medals. He tugged roughly at his sleeve. "None of this will help you. You probably think you're important here, huh? But you're nothing." He ripped one of the medals from Jerome's chest and threw it hard to the ground, stomping on it with his boot. Jerome made no move in response. He just closed his eyes. It wasn't because he couldn't respond. It was because he carried his resentment inside himself. He knew that every answer he gave would only add to the humiliation. Blake reached down and pulled another medal from his chest, dropping it back onto the pavement. "This is your medal, veteran. Your true status. You are nothing." He looked into Jerome's eyes, and his own met his, eyes full of contempt. "You are just one of those puppets we train to fight so they can come home and be disgraced. And all this for what? To wear this uniform here, like it does anything?" The crowd watched quietly. Jerome didn't know what to feel. It was painful, but at the same time, in a strange way, he felt like he was ready to go through this. He had already been through pain that no one else could see. Pain that could not be shared. Nothing Blake could say could break him. But inside, he knew that this was his test. Not so much a physical one, but a mental one. Blake, seeing his silence, laughed. "You don't like being humiliated? Well, you're not the only one. There are many of you. Black, with uniforms. You think you can command?" The crowd began to whisper. A few people laughed, and one man took a few pictures with a phone in his hand. Jerome couldn't tell if it was laughter from anger or amusement, but he knew that to them, he was not a person. He was part of this scene, part of some kind of spectacle they were watching. "Take off that uniform so as not to disgrace our streets," Blake said, hitting him on the shoulder again, causing him to stagger slightly. At that moment, Jerome felt something explode inside him. He stepped forward and said calmly, "I take it off every day. When I wake up and realize that none of these medals mean anything in this city, they won't see me anyway, but you, Blake, will see me." His words rang out loudly, and at that moment, everyone fell silent. They all stood there, not knowing what to say, what to do, what would happen next. Blake frowned. He pulled Jerome's shoulder again, hard, and yanked him down so that he would kneel. Everything around him seemed to freeze. "This is what you need. You need to understand your place." But Jerome did not give in. He did not fall to his knees. He stood up. Everything was clear. He was not ready to humiliate himself. This was not a protest. This was an understanding of his strength and his weakness at the same time. He was in his own world. He had experienced what the crowd had not experienced, and he would never be able to understand what was happening inside someone who held onto that line. On the line where you are constantly reminded that you are unimportant. But he was not ready to lose. His pride was inside him, and that pride was all he had left. Blake laughed, but the laugh was empty. He looked at Jerome again. "You're going to regret this," he said. But Jerome was already gone. He just turned and walked down the street. He knew that his victory wasn't about winning this moment. It was about getting through this moment without breaking. Not for them. Not for Blake. For himself. That day, Jerome realized, no medal mattered. Nothing mattered. He was just the one who wasn't wanted, and that was it. He was nothing to everyone around him, and that wasn't a tragedy. It was a truth he'd learned to live with. Jerome walked along the sidewalk without quickening his pace. He did not feel annoyed that he was being followed again, did not feel the need to speed up or change his path. He had become so accustomed to it that this city seemed to him like some kind of abandoned zone, where he simply existed, like a shadow, deprived of the ability to change anything. Today, his day was empty, like many days before. He did not look for reasons to quarrel, did not provoke collisions, but despite this, he knew that at any moment he could become the center of another scene. And it was at this moment, when he was passing a small cafe, that he heard footsteps, noisy, approaching, fast. He looked back for a second. It was Blake. And not alone. There were several police officers with him. He did not understand why they came to him of all people, why their attention was so concentrated on him. Understanding came later. It was not accidental. Blake approached Jerome with an expression of confidence, almost a smirk on his face. He wasn't there on business, but his presence was always wary. "Where are you going, soldier?" Blake asked, making it clear that this meeting was no accident. Jerome froze, all his senses on edge. He knew something bad was coming, something he couldn't avoid, but there was no point in trying to avoid it. He answered calmly, "I'm walking down the street, officer." He saw Blake's eyes narrow. There was more to that look than just aggression. It was the look of someone who had long ago decided that Jerome was not a man. He was something to be watched, something to be suppressed. He was black, he was a veteran, and to Blake that meant he was a threat. "Are you crazy, man?" Blake said, shaking his head. "Have you forgotten where you are?" Those weren't words, they were accusations. Hatred hidden under a mask of good nature. The police around him stirred. Jerome felt himself surrounded. It was like a trap, a prearranged one, with no escape. "Are you out of your mind?" Blake moved closer. And before Jerome could even process what was happening, Blake's hand was on his shoulder, roughly spinning him around. He felt the weight of the movement, felt his body instinctively tense, trying to maintain balance. But Blake was strong. He pushed Jerome with all his might, pinning him to the asphalt. This was not an arrest. This was a trap. This was annihilation. Jerome couldn't understand how this could happen. But he knew that this moment was no accident. It had already been predicted. This was not the first attack, and it would not be the last. He was just another target for Blake. "What will you do if I don't cooperate?" Jerome said through clenched teeth. Blake did not answer. His hand gripped Jerome's shoulder, and despite his attempts to resist, he quickly pushed him to the ground. Blake's knee slammed into Jerome's neck, pinning him to the pavement. The sensation was familiar, like being back on the battlefield. He felt his breathing become ragged, his chest constricting, making it increasingly difficult to breathe. His ears began to ring. Sounds became muffled. He could see the sky at that moment, but it wasn't blue. It was dark and black, like a ghost of what was happening to him. His face was glued to the ground, and all he could see was dirt, dust, and distant reflections that flickered like a threat. People stood and watched. Some took out their phones, some laughed quietly. There were those who simply stood aside, not interfering. It was as familiar as the sky he saw every day in battle. Only here, instead of an actual enemy, there was a system standing in his way. "Stick, Blake. You're overdoing it," one of the cops said. But Blake ignored him and pressed his knee harder into Jerome's neck. Jerome tried not to panic, tried to stay focused, but the air was disappearing. He could feel his body shrinking, his strength ebbing, but he knew that if he gave in now, if he started to panic, he would lose. And he wasn't going to lose. He was alive, and that meant he still had a chance. Meanwhile, the crowd continued to watch. A few people were filming everything on their phones, laughing, one shouting, "Maybe this is war, huh?" The word war had become part of this city, part of a war that didn't end even when you went home. Jerome couldn't breathe. He felt his chest being squeezed by Blake, his stomach clenching, every breath a fight for survival. But he held on, not for Blake, not for the people filming, for himself. "You know you can't do this, Blake," one of the policemen said, but the other man didn't seem to hear him. He was lost in his rage, in his power. "We'll see how you breathe after this," Blake whispered, pressing his knee even harder. Jerome felt tears streaming down his eyes, but they weren't from pain. They were tears of frustration. He knew that no matter what, he still couldn't change anything. His medals were on the pavement. His honor was crushed. His face was dirty. It was a humiliation he didn't deserve, but one he was not allowed to escape. And again, like the first time, his body felt like a stranger to him. At that moment, he realized that he had become just one of those whom the system was breaking. He had become part of a machine that trampled everything that stood in its way. But then, in the midst of all this pain and humiliation, he still said to himself, "I am still alive." And that was enough. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from. Have you had anything similar in your life, moments when you had to face injustice or humiliation? We really value your opinion and want to hear your stories. If you like what we do, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new chapters. And now, let's continue. The asphalt was hot, as if scorched by the sun, but Jerome felt not the heat of the sun, but the weight of a knee on his neck, pressing, dull, cruel. He did not move. He could not. His face was pressed to the ground, his arms twisted behind his back, his wrists squeezed by the cold metal of handcuffs. Blake stood over him, heavy, arrogant, triumphant. He did not shout, did not spit words, but his whole body, his whole expression said, "Now you are in your place." The crowd surrounded them, like a herd in which no one was ready to act, but everyone was ready to watch. People took out their phones, filmed, streamed, whispered. Someone said, "It's his own fault, he must have done something." Someone whispered, "These again, they always cause trouble." A man in glasses walked past indifferently, shaking his head slightly. This is what happens when you come home and think you can do anything. Laughter. A small group of teenagers Jerome had seen earlier stood across the street, laughing as if this was a performance staged especially for them. "Is he crazy? He thought his uniform would save him," one of them shouted. "Hey, veteran, remember how to crawl," another shouted. More laughter. Jerome was silent. He made no sound. He just lay there, feeling each breath become more difficult. The sun beat down on the back of his head, as if on purpose, as an accomplice to this act of humiliation. His chest pressed against the asphalt, his breath tore out like from a wounded animal. But he didn't ask. He didn't call. He knew that no one would come here. No one would ask what was happening. Because for them, everything that was happening was normal. One of the police officers standing nearby said quietly, almost emotionlessly, "Can we have enough already?" But Blake did not react. He stood over Jerome, as if pressing him into the ground, not just with his body, but with the entire system, the entire history, all the hatred that had been building in his blood for years. He said without looking at his colleague, "He resisted. I saw it in his eyes." It was not a statement, but a sentence. Jerome wanted to scream, but he knew better, because every scream only strengthened their conviction that he was a threat. Another policeman, young, confused, stepped closer, but Blake gave him a look that usually makes you look away, and he stepped back. The crowd began to buzz again. Someone said, "Get a close-up. Let them see who they call heroes." The camera moved closer. Jerome felt his face being captured in someone's lens. Dirt, blood from a cut lip, beads of sweat and dust. He knew the video would go viral, but he didn't know if it would do any good, because he'd seen videos like this before. Too many. And most of the time, they ended with the victim being blamed. "You wanted to play the hero, and now you're lying around like a dog," Blake whispered. His voice was calm, almost benevolent. "Be grateful we didn't shoot you. We don't usually stand on ceremony." He sighed, as if he was tired of the whole spectacle, but inside, triumph was growing. He had achieved what he wanted. He had brought Jerome to his knees, literally. Jerome felt the ground beneath him become a part of him. Not metaphorically, but literally. Every millimeter of skin pressing into the asphalt. Every cell remembering that touch of humiliation. He remembered how, in the war, he too had once been pressed into the ground when mines landed. There, it had been salvation. Here, it was execution. His legs felt like they had been cut off from his body. He couldn't feel his arm, just a burning sensation, just a dull throb in his joints. He didn't know how much time had passed. Minutes? An eternity? When Blake finally lifted his knee, Jerome couldn't breathe right away. The air rushed into his lungs like a blow, a painful reminder that he was still alive. He was jerked to his feet. He was unsteady, unable to stand. His knees were shaking. He was dragged to the car like a sack. "Got a gun?" one of the policemen asked, though they could see that he was wearing nothing but his uniform and medals, now covered in dust. "He's a gun," Blake said. He was thrown into the back seat. The car started moving. Jerome looked out the window, but he saw no faces. Only silhouettes, only backs, only indifference. This city hadn't turned its back on him today. Today, he had simply shown his true colors. The car stopped at the station. They ordered him out. He couldn't. They dragged him, carried him. In the hall, the same looks, the same faces. Someone was writing something down. Someone was clicking away at the keys without looking. They didn't give him water. They didn't give him a phone call. Just a cell. Small, dark, stinking. The door slammed shut with a dull metallic sound. He was left alone with the silence. Only then did he allow himself to close his eyes. Not to forget. To survive. He knew. This is not the end. This is just the beginning. But he also knew it will not be possible to break him completely. Even here, even now, even with his face in the asphalt. Because inside him, the memory still lived. Not about the awards, not about the glory, but about those who died next to him. About those who did not live to see their friend lying in handcuffs in front of an indifferent crowd. And he swore, if he survived, he would tell. Everything. Night, silence, unbroken by the sounds of the city or the life beyond. Jerome lay on the stone floor, his body still aching, his hands cuffed. He knew that no one would come to him now. No one would know what was happening here, in this tiny cell, where his face still remembered the pressure of Blake, where his neck was tired but not broken. In the corner of the cell, that uniform. It lay curled up like a dead flag. His uniform, his medals, his pride, everything that had once symbolized his strength and honesty and courage seemed utterly meaningless now. He didn't know how much time had passed since they had brought him here, but he could feel his strength ebbing. He rose from the floor, groped for the fabric, ran his fingers over it, as if it were something that had once been a part of him. He tore the fabric, first one side, then the other. His hands were shaking, but he kept going. Destruction. It was an act of liberation, but liberation from what? What was he getting rid of? Those medals? The pride they once gave him? Or himself? There was desperation in every movement. There was pain in every tear in the fabric. The ripping of each seam was like a self-inflicted cut. He was constricted, but despite it, he kept going. How could he have been so naive? How could he have believed that that uniform, those medals, all of it would ever make him important? A hero. That's what they had called him in the war. But here, in this city, with that face, that colour, that past, he was no hero. He was a menace. And today, he was nothing. To everyone, to this city, to everyone who passed by, to those who laughed. He felt his pride melting away, turning to dust. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was his final test, his final attempt to understand what it all meant. Everything he had been through, everything he had become, was nothing. He knew he was just a tool in someone else's hands. He was part of a system that used him and discarded him when there was no need for his body, for his life. He tore the uniform to pieces without thinking about what he was doing. He didn't feel like a man. He felt like nothing. He raised his hand, ripped the buttons off, tore the fabric from every seam. He felt no pride. He felt nothing but pain. The emotions he couldn't put into words seemed too strong for him. He knew he would not go home. The house that had once been his fortress was now empty. Jerome closed his eyes, heard the fabric tear, and felt something inside him tear too. It didn't feel like liberation. It felt like destruction. When the last of his uniform was on the floor, torn and full of torn seams, Jerome crouched in the corner of the cell. His eyes were as empty as the city where he tried to find his way. His life was like this destruction, unfinished, incomplete, useless. He cried. But these tears were not tears of pain, they were tears of shame. He didn't know why he was crying. Maybe because he no longer believed in his medals. Maybe because they meant nothing to those who saw him. Maybe because everything he had fought for was a lie. He was a hero on the battlefield, but here, in this city, in this precinct, he was nothing. He was the one who had to be punished. He was the one who had become an enemy without even asking why. He felt his inner world crumbling. He wanted to forget about it, to get out of this nightmare, but he knew this nightmare would now be with him forever, and nothing could change that. He could no longer look at himself in the mirror. He could no longer think about his medals. He could no longer feel like he belonged on the front lines, because here, in this cell, he was no longer there. He was just the one everyone despised. He was the one who could not respond nor change. The tears kept falling onto the floor. He didn't try to stop them. He didn't know why. He just didn't know how to stop them. This process of destruction that had taken everything from him, not just the uniform, not just the medals, but what he thought he had. Pride, honor, courage, all of it had become nothing. He sat there, trying to pick himself up, but no matter how hard he tried, he felt like he couldn't recreate who he had been before. He was broken. He wasn't strong. He wasn't who he wanted to be. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a man. He was just lost. A lost man among hundreds just like him. He didn't know who he was anymore. He didn't know what to do. This night wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the end. And that night, in the torn pieces of his uniform, Jerome realized that he would never be the same again. He had become someone he couldn't imagine being with. He had become the hated one, the one who was suppressed. He was nothing, and that was all that was happening to him. But his spirit, his soul, all of that was destroyed not the moment he was thrown into the cell, but the moment he realized that he was no longer seen as a person. He was no longer seen as alive, but only as an object to be survived. And that was the most terrible thing. Jerome was awakened by a loud noise. Instantly, as if by inspiration, his body tensed, but the cell was dark, quiet, and that made it unbearably hard. He had already gotten used to the idea that every day, every night would be the same. A wall, hunger, silence, and his own thoughts. But today, there was something different. He could not understand what exactly, but he felt that he would not stay here forever. Not right away. But something was happening. The room was empty, but in the corridor, he could hear footsteps, many footsteps. He did not know what it was. The thought flashed through his mind that he would be taken away again, that he would be handcuffed again, and this cycle of humiliation would begin again. However, when the cell door opened, Jerome did not feel the usual weight of metal and pressure on his shoulders. He stood up and carefully approached the exit, not knowing what to expect. He was literally dragged out of the cell, not roughly, but with obvious intent. The words the guard said didn't immediately register with him. "You're free. You're being released." He froze. His thoughts were racing. Free? How could that be? He'd been arrested on charges of disorderly conduct, and the thing he was most likely to be charged with was resisting. But how could he be released? He couldn't believe it. They led him down the hallway. His head was spinning, and for several minutes, Jerome couldn't understand what was happening. It wasn't until they reached the street that he heard the guard say, "The YouTube video. That changed everything." Jerome stopped and looked at the guard, as if trying to process what the man had just said. "What? The video?" The guard nodded. "Some guy filmed you on his phone while they were holding you down. You went viral." And it was true. The video of his arrest, his humiliation, his suffering, quickly spread across the internet. Thousands of people began discussing what was happening. Thousands of people demanding justice. The video showed Blake with his knee pinning Jerome to the ground while the crowd laughed, filmed, and stood by. The video captured the shame of this city, and the next day, it went viral. There were hundreds of comments under the video. Some wrote, "Shame on the police." Some wrote, "Is this still happening?" There were many people protesting. It became obvious to many that this was not normal. This was not just an arrest. This was violence. This was racism. This was the brutal humiliation of a man who had come home to rebuild his life. It was live and people saw it. But Jerome knew that this was not just his victory. It was a victory for people who believe in justice, no matter what. A few hours after the video was published, a wave of indignation began. Journalists took notice of the case, and soon articles began to appear. Officer Blake accused of brutality against citizen. The headlines flew across the internet. 2 days later, the trial was scheduled. By that point, Jerome was already free, but his life had changed. Everything he knew about himself and this city was now crumbling. He was amazed that among all these people who rejected him, there were those who were ready to stand up for him. But he knew this was just the beginning. This was not just a personal vendetta. This was a way to show that the system could not remain silent. This was a moment for change. When Jerome arrived at the courthouse, he was met by a crowd. The people were not thrilled, but they did not come to support Blake. They came to support him. They came to remember what racism was, what brutality was. Jerome knew these people did not come for him. They came for justice, for those who were trampled by this society and forgotten, and he was ready to stand for it. When the trial began, Jerome was not the one standing in the spotlight. He stood in the dock. But this was no longer just his case. He was no longer just a black veteran arrested by a police officer. He had become a symbol for all those who felt like they had been the victim of injustice. The courtroom was full. In the dock sat not only him, but also his accuser. Blake, the officer who had once humiliated him, pinned him to the ground with his knee, was now under scrutiny. His face was more intense than ever. He sat up straight, his gaze cold, with a hint of contempt, but there was no confidence in his eyes anymore. The judge called the trial to begin. The room was tense. There was no evidence in Jerome's case that he had broken the law. He had not resisted. He had not threatened. He had simply been the victim of whatever Blake saw fit, and the videotape was the star of the show. The questions began to come at Blake. He answered them confidently, but with each question, his confidence weakened. He tried to justify himself, saying that the arrest was necessary, that Jerome showed aggression. But the camera doesn't lie. The video clearly showed that Jerome wasn't trying to do anything. He wasn't resisting. Blake continued to justify himself, but with each passing moment, his words lost their meaning. Everyone in the room saw that he was lying. The prosecutor pointed to the video. "Look at this. Look at how this police officer, with all the power on his side, behaves with a man who just wanted to walk down the street." The prosecutor continued. "And look at what was happening around him. People were standing there, filming on their phones, but no one stopped the violence. Because this system protects those who serve it, even if they commit crimes." Everything Jerome had been through these days was now becoming public. He was not just a veteran. He was an example of making this process visible. Blake began to lose his composure. His calm was just an illusion. With every accusation, with every look they threw at him, he cringed. His confidence crumbled like sand, and everyone realized that he could no longer hide the truth. The judge called a recess. The courtroom fell silent. Jerome remained seated, his body still shaking from what had just happened. But inside him, there was more strength than ever. In that moment, with all eyes on his story, he realized that despite everything, despite the pain he had endured, he had become someone who could make an impact on this city, on this system, and he was not alone. That day, as Blake's trial began, Jerome felt that for him, this was not just a fight. It was the beginning of something more important. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from and whether you have had an experience similar to what happens in these stories. It is important for us to know your opinion and share your experience. If you like what we do, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. And now, let's continue. Jerome couldn't believe he was standing in that courtroom again. This moment, standing in the middle of what had once seemed impossible, he couldn't hide the wave of conflicting emotions. He was wearing a suit. He was wearing a tie, black shoes, hands that didn't shake. He wasn't the man who'd laid face down on the pavement, humiliated, reduced to nothing. He stood in that courtroom today, not as a criminal, but as someone who could make a difference. He felt like everything that had happened to him up until that moment was part of something bigger, part of a process that would prove to everyone that the system that protected people like Blake had to be torn down. The courtroom was packed. Reporters sat at tables with cameras, watching every move, every word spoken in the room. The crowd outside was waiting. Jerome couldn't see them, but he knew they were there, and that their attention would be on him until the trial was over. He sat next to his lawyer, watching Blake on the other side. Officer Blake, still in uniform, but now under suspicion. He seemed oblivious to the tension that hung in the air like a fog. His confidence was frightening, radiating off him like some vile poison. He was sure the system would shut him down, that nothing would change. He couldn't understand that this trial wasn't just about Jerome. It was about everyone he had humiliated. All those who couldn't answer to the system because their voices had been silenced. For Blake, this was just another stage in which he would emerge victorious. He grinned calmly, with that expression on his face that Jerome remembered so well from the first time he'd been under his feet. But now their roles were reversed. Jerome was the one sitting in a suit, head up, with the dignity he had reclaimed for himself. Blake was the one who now, as if on a battlefield, found himself at a disadvantage. He stood before the court, but his confidence began to weaken with every word the prosecutor spoke. This man, the prosecutor began, pointing at Blake, took it upon himself to humiliate a man simply because of the color of his skin. He used his power to oppress and intimidate without any justification. This is not just abuse of power. This is racism in its purest form. This is violence that was designed to crush the dignity, to destroy everything that was left in this man. He pointed to Jerome, sitting in the bench. That's who was guilty here. The one on the ground, not the one standing over him, burning his soul. Jerome did not look away. He was looking at Blake. He was not the man who could remain silent now. He was the man who was ready to tell the truth. The prosecutor's words were so clear that it was hard to breathe in the courtroom. People were whispering. Some were beginning to understand that Blake was not who he thought he was. He was a cop. But more than that, he was part of a system that turned a blind eye to crime and said it was okay. He was someone who prided himself on humiliating people and thought he could get away with it. But now that he was caught, now that it was all clear, he felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Blake chuckled. His face remained calm, almost impassive, as if he was sure it was just another day at work. He looked at Jerome, and his gaze was full of contempt. "I do not admit my guilt," he said, and his words sounded like spit. "I was right. I followed instructions. What happened was a misunderstanding." He looked at Jerome again. He was aggressive. He resisted. I couldn't just stand there and watch him threaten me. His words were muffled without feeling, but there was a confidence in them that he had long since lost. He could not hide the panic that was beginning to show in his gestures. Jerome listened, and his heart didn't beat, didn't worry. He didn't feel angry. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted the world to see what had happened. He was the one who could now say, I'm here, and this is my truth. Blake's lawyer, seeing his client beginning to lose confidence, tried to intervene. He argued that everything had happened according to standard procedure, that Jerome may not have behaved as he should have. He tried to defend Blake, but the prosecutor responded again. It is because of people like your client that what we see every day on the streets happens. The police are supposed to protect, not bully. These people who come into contact with the police cannot be targets for destruction. The prosecutor's gaze sharpened, and his words became sharp and precise, like a knife. Police officers like Blake are supposed to not only maintain order, but also respect the rights of the people. He was arrested without cause. His medals were destroyed. His dignity was destroyed. This is a crime, and it will not go without consequences. Blake was silent, but there was no longer confidence in his eyes. He was the one who had once burned the pride of others, and now he found himself under the same fire. He was beginning to realize that this time his defense would not help. This time, the system he loved and trusted so much might not support him. Fate, which had always been on his side, now seemed decisive in a different light. He understood. His time had passed. With each witness, with each new piece of evidence that confirmed Blake's crimes, his certainty was shattered. As the trial continued, it became clearer. He was the one who had to be punished, not because he had simply arrested Jerome, but because he had become part of something that could not continue. He had become the personification of an injustice that had to be destroyed. Jerome felt everything around him change. He had been the one on the front lines, but now his role was to stand on the side of truth. And every step he took in that room, every look he met, every moment, Blake began to lose his confidence. It was a victory for him, but not a victory in the way he had once thought. A victory in making the world see that what had happened to him shouldn't happen to others. A victory in proving that justice was possible, and he knew he wouldn't stop. He couldn't afford to stop. He was alive, and that was enough. As the trial wore on, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew increasingly tense. Every day, this trial became a reminder to everyone present of how far injustice can go and how difficult it can be to stop. Blake sat across from Jerome, not hiding his confusion. He was not as confident as he had been at the beginning of the trial. He felt like the ground was slipping out from under his feet. Fate, which had always been on his side before, was now beginning to lean in Jerome's direction. But then came the most crucial part, when she appeared in the witness box. An elderly white woman who seemed to be a complete stranger to everything that was happening in this room. She was not an activist. She was not a lawyer. She was an ordinary woman who happened to witness Jerome's arrest, but her testimony became a turning point in this trial. The whole room froze when she stepped out from behind the stands and stood before the court. Her face was tired, old, with wrinkles that told of many years of life, of many tragedies and joys. She was simple, unremarkable. But her eyes full of pain and determination, they said more than words. She coughed before she began to speak. Her voice trembled, and it seemed as if every sound that came out of her was written with years of silence. But the words she spoke were sharp as knives, cutting the air and piercing everyone in the room. "I was there," she said quietly, but so that her words were heard by everyone. "I was standing on that street when it happened. I saw Officer Blake pull that man over. I saw how he treated him." She paused, wiping tears from her eyes, but continued. "I saw the beast, and it wasn't Jerome." The words hung in the air. They were so simple, but so terrible. The room froze, even the jury. No one dared speak, and Blake seemed to have become even more unrecognizable. He clenched his jaw, but his body was no longer the same confident, powerful policeman it had been before. He knew that this woman, a seemingly random witness, was now on the side of truth. She was the one who saw. She was the one who spoke the truth. She said what Jerome could not say then, at that moment, when his face was pressed to the asphalt. She said words that were impossible to ignore. Blake sat with his head hung. He could not meet her gaze. She continued, her voice becoming more and more confident, but it still trembled, as if every word brought her pain. "I can't forget what I saw. When I saw how he pinned him to the ground, I realized he was not defending himself. He was not a threat. This was an ordinary person who was simply decided to humiliate. I saw Officer Blake press him. I saw his hands cuffed. I saw his face as he lay on the ground, and I heard the other people laugh. But I didn't laugh. I couldn't. I knew something was wrong. I saw the beast in the other one. She turned and looked at Blake, her eyes full of tears and anger. You were the beast. It wasn't Jerome. It was you. Those words were like lightning bolts that struck straight to the heart. The entire courtroom froze. People began to whisper, but no one dared to say a word. The judge was watching the situation closely, and even he seemed affected by those words. The jurors began to look away from Blake. They couldn't look at him the same way anymore. He was no longer just a defendant to them. He was someone who used his power to destroy. And they saw it. They saw now what this woman saw. She was their eyes. She was the person who was forced to tell the truth despite her fear. Jerome sat in his chair, motionless. He felt his chest fill with pride, but not pride in his medals, not pride in his service. He felt pride in his truth. He was alive, and his truth was his strength. He knew that maybe this woman could not understand everything that was happening in his life, but she understood one thing. She understood that what was happening to him was wrong, and she was willing to say so. This was more than a witness. This was proof that the world should not remain silent when injustice occurs. Blake could no longer hide behind his confident speeches, behind his lies. He could not hide what he did behind defenses, behind excuses. He was exposed. His face no longer seemed so confident. There was panic in his eyes, which seemed to be showing with every word the woman uttered. His own power was beginning to crumble, and with every look, with every testimony, his position grew weaker. The prosecutor, seeing the situation escalating, continued with a sharp edge in his voice. Listen, everyone in this room can see. This man, this police officer, used his power to humiliate, to degrade an innocent man. He turned to Blake, and his voice became as hard as stone. He was not a threat. This was just a man who walked down the street and became a victim of the system. Blake tried to justify himself, but his words were losing force with each passing moment. He tried to justify his actions, saying that he had no choice, that Jerome looked dangerous, that he acted aggressively. But it didn't matter anymore. What he had done was caught on video, and now every witness in the room could see who was telling the truth and who was lying. Blake couldn't believe he had been exposed like this. He tried to remain calm, but there was already anxiety in his eyes, uncertainty, and it was clear proof that even the system he had been in for so long could betray him. The prosecutor didn't give him a chance to justify himself. He said, looking into his eyes, "You may not have the conscience to admit it, but the truth is here. What you did was not just a mistake. It was a crime." The judge watched in silence. The room fell silent, and the jurors began to look away from Blake, as if all those looks had become a heavy burden for him. He was no longer who he had always thought he was. He was no longer above others, and he was no longer safe. Let's take a short break. Write in the comments where you listen to our stories from, and whether you have had similar situations in your life. It is important for us to know your opinion and hear your experiences. If you like what we do, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new chapters. And now, let's continue. The trial was drawing to a close. The courtroom was tense as a tightrope. Every moment, every word seemed to be able to break this fragile atmosphere. There was no noise, no gestures in the courtroom. Everyone sat in silence. Everyone who came here was waiting for a decision. All these days, Jerome had been going through pain and humiliation. But in this room, there was no room for doubt now. He knew that the truth was on his side, but it did not give him relief. The moment when the truth becomes an instrument of destruction is the moment when you begin to realize that you are still alone, despite all those who are with you. He was still a black man in this world, in which he was condemned before he even had time to say anything. His life was not an easy path, and this trial was just another milestone in a history where one of the sides always remained broken. The judge slowly placed his papers on the table, and silence fell over the courtroom. In his hands were the words that would change not only the lives of two people, but also the community that was watching. He looked up at Blake. Blake sat motionless, his jaw clenched, his eyes filled with intense confidence. He didn't believe that anything could change the decision. He was sure that he would come out of here a winner. He was a police officer. He was part of a system that had always protected him. He couldn't believe that he could be found guilty, but the judge said, "The defendant, Police Officer Blake, is found guilty of abuse of power, racial discrimination, and cruelty to citizen Jerome." The phrase hung in the air like a heavy burden. It wasn't just words. It was an admission that society could no longer remain silent. It was an admission that this time the victim, Jerome, was right, and he had won. The room went silent, but only for Blake. Jerome sat as if nothing had happened. He felt no joy, no victory. He felt empty. He felt his soul still contracting, but now it was not from pain, but from some strange release. He was alive, and that was enough. Blake stood up. His face was pale, but he still looked as if nothing had changed. His eyes, full of despair and fury, met Jerome's. He couldn't hide his anger. His knees were shaking slightly, but he held on. Something was cracking inside him, but outwardly he was the same policeman everyone had once respected. He rose slowly, straightening his back like a man accustomed to power. He couldn't comprehend that this power was now leaving. Soon he would lose everything that had once seemed unshakable to him. In his eyes was the look of a man who could not understand how he could lose, how he, Blake, could be found guilty. He approached Jerome. His voice was quiet, but sounded with complete confidence. "You will still be nothing." These words sounded like the final blow. He said it as if he was sure that Jerome would still end up on the bottom, that this victory meant nothing, that he would always be someone who was of no importance to anyone. It was like a deadly certainty that no sentence or evidence could save him from. Jerome was silent. He did not answer. Not because he could not answer. He knew there was no point in answering. The answer was already in his silence. He looked into Blake's eyes, and his gaze was full of something new. It was not evil. It was not revenge. It was simply an acknowledgement of his pain and his victory. Because to win is not to destroy. To win is to leave behind all the fears, humiliations, and pain that were inflicted on you, and to come out of it alive. He knew that now he was the man they could not break, no matter how strong their weapons, their system, their views. He was still alive, and that was enough. The crowd in the hall fell silent. Everyone watched Blake, who was still trying to cope with the fact that his life would never be the same again. There was rage in his eyes, but not the rage with which he went out into the streets to crush others. It was rage mixed with a sense of defeat. He could not believe that after all those years of service, after all those years of being sure that the system would cover for him, now he himself was being blamed. Now he himself was being humiliated. He was the one who had always seemed invincible, but now he had become an example for others who had been left behind by the system. His face was bitter, like the last straw on a battlefield. He knew that at this moment, his life, his career, his reputation were crumbling, and he could not change it. Jerome didn't move. He didn't feel joy, but he didn't feel pain either. He felt the pieces of his world finally falling into place, but that place didn't bring him relief. He wasn't the one who could say, "I won." The victory was in something else. The victory was that, despite everything, he remained human. He, despite everything, remained the one who didn't let them destroy his essence, his personality. He was the one who was able to go through it without breaking. He was the one who survived. The judge raised his hand and announced the verdict. Blake was sentenced to prison, but Jerome knew that it wouldn't change much. He knew it would be hard, that there would be a lot of problems. But this moment, when Blake was found guilty, was his moment. This was his test, which he survived, and in this was his triumph. He knew that he would still have a long fight, that he still had a long way to go. But he was ready. He was ready to move forward. As Blake was led away, Jerome remained standing. His shoulders were straight. He felt that for him, this trial was not the end. It was the beginning of a new life, a new fight. And this fight was more important than anything else. It was a fight not only for him, but for those who remained behind the scenes, for those whom the system tried to destroy, but could not, and there was no longer fear in his heart. Jerome walked out of the courtroom, and the moment the doors closed behind him, his body felt like it was weakening. All this time, everything he had been through was clenching inside him. And now that the decision had been made, that Blake had been convicted, Jerome felt no relief. He felt no joy. He couldn't. Instead of feeling the relief of victory, he felt a strange sense of emptiness. He had won. Yes, he had survived. But this was not what he had expected. He had expected a different world, different people, a different life. He had expected everything to change. But when he looked at the world around him, he realized that despite everything, nothing had changed. The city had not changed. The people had not changed. He was still who he had been seen as before. An outsider, an object of hatred who simply could not find a place in this world. Through the glass doors that led to the street, he saw the world. A world that went on as if nothing had happened. People walked along the sidewalks as before, their eyes ignoring him. He was invisible again. He was still not welcome in this city. They did not see him as a winner. To them, he was just another black man whose life did not matter. He felt his soul shrink, as if this victory was not real to him. He had become a symbol, a part of this process. But it was so alien that it seemed as if this victory could never be his. All this pain, this journey, this humiliating struggle did not lead to what he wanted. He did not want to be a symbol. He did not want to be an example for others. He just wanted to be alive. He felt the silence wash over him. He stepped outside, and the air felt cold despite the summer day. He couldn't find it in himself to smile, no matter how expected. He couldn't feel the joy of what he had experienced. Everything was shattered. Everything he had once hoped to find here, respect, recognition, the chance to live in peace, had turned out to be a lie. His victory meant nothing to those who had always seen him as a threat, who had always considered him an enemy because he was the one they didn't want in this city. He was the one who reminded them of their own fears, of the stereotypes they had worked so hard to forget. His gaze, turned towards the crowd, was not angry, but it was filled with weariness. It was not just weariness from fighting, it was weariness from life itself. He looked at the people passing by and understood. They did not understand. They did not know what this had cost him. They did not see that behind every victory there was a pain that could not be expressed in words. He could not explain to them how hard it was to live without confidence in the future, how hard it was to be the one who always had to prove his worth. He felt something tearing inside him. Blake had been condemned, but nothing had changed in his life. This city continued to move forward, not noticing him, not noticing that Jerome, despite everything, was standing. He was still alive, and that was enough. But it did not bring joy. It only brought silence. He kept walking, step by step, as if his legs had no strength. He passed bars, shops, faces that couldn't see him. But he knew they saw him. They only saw him when his life became news to them. They saw him when his body became an object of humiliation, an object they could simply watch and forget. But they didn't see him when he was just walking down the street, when he was returning home from court, when he was faced with the same stares, the same cruel assessments. He knew that victories in court were not victories in life. He was not welcome on the street anyway. He was the one who would always be the odd one out. His phone rang several times, but he didn't answer. He knew that friends and journalists wanted to congratulate him. They wanted him to feel proud, but he didn't feel proud. He felt his soul shrink, as if he were back on that very street where he had been pushed, where he had been humiliated. And at that moment, despite everything that had happened, he couldn't feel like a winner. He wasn't ready to celebrate. He wasn't ready to rejoice. He walked into a nearby park and sat down on a bench, leaning his elbows against the back. He looked up at the sky, and in his eyes was a question he couldn't ask anyone. Why? Why did he have to go through all this? Why did his life have to become part of this city, this system that always wanted to break him but couldn't? He wasn't sure he could find an answer to that, but he was alive. He wasn't broken. He survived. His gaze fell to the ground. He saw the leaves falling from the trees. It was a moment when everything around him moved on its own, and he remained standing in place, watching. He did not know how much time had passed. He just sat there, staring into the void. Everything was mixed up in his head. He could not find the strength to move forward. He was alive, but he did not feel life. There was pain and victory in his eyes at the same time. But this victory was not a moment of breathlessness. This victory was long, painful, but it still meant one thing. He was still standing. After a while, his gaze lifted, and he looked at the people passing by. He didn't try to catch their glances. He just knew that they didn't know anything. They didn't understand. But he was willing to live with that. He was willing to go through this because he had survived, because he was alive. He stood up from the bench and walked forward. His steps were slow but sure. He didn't know where this path would lead him, but he was ready to go. There was no joy in his heart, but there was something else, something that didn't let him fall. He was alive, and that was enough. What do you think about this story? Write in the comments if you have had similar cases in your life when you encountered racism or injustice. Your opinion is very important to us because each of you is a part of this story, and we sincerely appreciate each of you. Your thoughts and words make our work meaningful. Don't forget to like it if you enjoyed it, and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Let's wish each other a good day. And if you listen to the end, write a phrase in the comments that will show that you reached the last line. This is very important to us.